course, with genealogy comes graveyards, and Rick and Bill have taken an extreme interest in digging up stories. Behind the scene, when you look at a stone, you don't know what's there. They've discovered really interesting and weird stuff. They have a book coming out. Unfortunately, it's in publication. Rick has, during his teaching years, composed stories. He always has a story to tell. And his lovely wife, Jane, where are you there? Right there, is there. And I know Rick from forever. We grew up in Conway, we went to Kennett. We taught together eventually, and it's all yours.
It's all ours. Well, let me just give you a quick rundown of how this started. Both Bill and I we have two things that we've shared over the years. One of them is fly fishing. Bill was a guide, New Hampshire guide at one point, and the other was photography. And my wife and I ran a photography store for many years up in Conway, and we did photography for the whole area. And we had a studio and everything up in Conway. That was all in the film days. But at this point in time, I still put some pictures up on Instagram and on Facebook. So one day I'm on Instagram and I get this little message that says something to the effect is, would you like, I had put up a picture of a graveyard, something similar to this. And basically I get this message saying, would you like to do a book on graveyards? And my first impression, quite frankly, was, oh, this is a scam. Because there are people, it's not exactly a scam, but I mean, the books that I wrote over there that are fiction are published by somebody, and I didn't self-publish them. And, in today's world, that distinction doesn't really matter that much. But, there are these businesses out there that will say, okay, I'll publish your book, but you have to pay me, $20,000 and we'll get your book published. So anyway, I followed up on it, and eventually it turns out this is a British publishing company that does do primarily historical type books, not only, but primarily. And we had to jump through some hoops. Now, I mentioned earlier that Bill and I love to do the fly fishing and the photography. So at this point in our lives, when this happened, Bill and I were doing a lot of driving around New Hampshire just looking for pictures. Oddly enough, we haven't really fly fished that much recently. And part of that's because of this, I think. This took over our lives for over a year. So we literally followed all these stories, different places. Now, we're not doing genealogy. So, in that sense, I hope you'll still find this entertaining. But what we did do is we tried to find specific graveyards in some cases, or cemeteries, and in other cases specific graves. And what we did, we weren't looking so much for what was inscripted on those graves or inscribed, but basically what we were doing was, what's the story behind the person who's buried there? So these range from early, a lot of things down in the Portsmouth area that had a lot to do with the beginnings of this country. But we did cover the entire state all the way up to Pittsburgh and found various different interesting graves. How many did we find?
It was 116 cemeteries.
116. It was so many that we ended up having to have 2 books. So at some point there will be a volume 1 and a volume 2. Volume 1 is in the works right now. Unfortunately, as Jane mentioned, it's not out yet. Now, the other thing I just will mention quickly, if you do find what we're doing interesting, what we have done is also been doing, because once we finished the writing part of the book, the research part of the book, the photography part of the book, and got it all so it was laid out the way the publisher wanted it and sent out, we were going, now what are we going to do? So what we decided to do, and especially, both of us also because of our photography interest, we decided, let's make videos for YouTube. So we've made maybe 12,
I think there's, yeah, a little over 12, yeah.
a little over 12 videos right now that are on YouTube. And if you go to YouTube and just type in Buried New Hampshire, you will find our videos. They're very laid back. We don't dress up in a tie or anything for them. And I think we have to make it clear that, I was a philosophy major. What did you major in?
History.
History. So we do have a historian. But our intent was to really find these stories, and that they're, to do the best job we could in being, presenting what is true. In some cases, it's still basically what might be legend, because you just can't really prove whether it's true or not. But anyway, some of the stories from our books so far are under that Buried New Hampshire on YouTube. What we're going to do now, I think, is start going to some places that are not in our book, that may not even be in New Hampshire. But the two things that we had to do for the publisher, first of all, had to be New Hampshire, I guess obvious reasons, and the other was basically you did have to be buried here. We have a couple of exceptions to that in the book because they were so important in New Hampshire, or there was a grave we couldn't find. So anyway, so we can get into this. When Bill and I do our videos, the first thing I usually say to him is, "Where are we today, Bill?"
Well, I'm pretty sure we're in Wolfeboro.
Okay.
But I have no idea where there's so many people here that are alive.
I don't know.
I mean, usually
We haven't been around this many live people.
usually they're under a stone.
Yes, they are. It's what we did is we split this in half. So Bill wrote half the articles and took half the pictures, and I did the others. So the first one that really captured my imagination was this one, because both of us are Hemingway fans, especially the short stories.
Especially the fishing.
Especially the Nick Adams stories, which feature fly fishing or fishing. And so what really, I did not know this. How many people know, you do now, but how many people know that Hadley Richardson, do you know who Hadley was?
Yeah.
Hadley Richardson was Hemingway's Paris wife. The wife who was with him when he was in Paris with The Lost Generation, with Fitzgerald, James Joyce, Gertrude Stein, T.S. Eliot, you name it, from The Lost Generation. They were in Paris together, and there's a book called The Paris Wife, which is about Hadley Richardson. Now, if you know anything about Hemingway, you know that he would marry and then kind of move on to the next one. And I think, though, he regrets, at the end of his life, it was Hadley that stood out. Now, the other problem, now my wife is here, and I shouldn't probably admit this, but I fell in love with Hadley.
She's dead, so it's
If
okay.
she really was a very pretty woman, but also a very interesting one. Their grave is in Chicago. Now I say they because she went on after Hemingway to marry Paul Scott Maurer, who was indeed the first poet laureate in New Hampshire. He was also a a war correspondent and actually a friend of Hemingway's. They all knew each other, but it was almost 10 years, I believe, after Hemingway moved on to his next wife, that Hadley and Paul Maurer got together. But they moved to Chicago, apparently lived a very quiet life there. They were also avid fly fishermen, but or fly fishers. The Movable Feast by Hemingway is primarily about Hadley Richardson. Now again, it's Hemingway, so it's primarily about Hemingway. But basically, that book is written about those times. And she did meet Paul, who died at 84. But one thing that I was able to get a hold of was an interview that they did with her when she was older at the Kennedy Library. And basically, you get to listen to her talking about her life. And she really comes across as having been really kind of a cool lady who really had some fun in her life and some hardship, obviously. But how many knew? I didn't know. You know, I could have known her. I know she died in 79, I think, something like that. And she was a librarian for a while in Chicago. So, you know, this is the kind of thing that we were trying, that gives you a really pretty good idea of what we've been trying to do, is find out, okay, you know, I found out, oh, Hadley Richardson is in Chicago. You've got to be kidding. So we go and talk about it. I am breaking a rule here of presentations with PowerPoint, but I tried to, at one point sat down and tried to, how do I make this into, you know, bullets? And I felt like a lot was lost. So at least with this is pretty much what our book looks like. It's going to be the pictures and it's going to have the information. So that's what, you know, this is the one really about, it's about her. So moving on, we move on to Bill, and this one is also very interesting. I'm wondering how many people know about this.
That's very true. It was a great, the gentleman that we're going to be talking about is Richard Potter. He was born in 1783 and died in 1835. And we kind of found this guy actually long before we were interested in doing the book. We were just driving around taking photos, and we were out in Andover, New Hampshire. And Rick actually happened to look across and said, oh, there's an old railroad station down there. So that might be interesting. So we took a left around and she ended up into the little village of Potter, New Hampshire, which is actually a suburb of Andover, if you can. But it does have its own zip code. And it is named for a gentleman who was probably one of America's first and a great celebrity throughout the country. He was both a musician and a ventriloquist. And the interesting thing about this gentleman was that he was a black man. And of course, in that era, that was unheard of. And he passed himself off as, more or less, as a white man. But he sometimes said that he was of Hindu extraction from the Far East, which led to the mystery, of course, of being a musician and a ventriloquist. He was born in Hopkinton, Massachusetts, and his mother was a Diana, and she was a slave of Sir Charles Farquhar. Now, I don't know a lot about that, but the Farquhar family were apparently quite well-to-do, and they traveled to England quite often. And Diana went along and as part of the household. So apparently, so did Richard. But there was also a story that he was a cabin boy on a ship and ended up in England. But whatever the reason, he ended up with a Scottish musician and a ventriloquist by the name of John Rainey. And Richard joined up as his assistant, and that's how he learned his trade. So he returned to the United States along with Renee's son, and they traveled around for quite a while, and Richard acted as his assistant in his act. But eventually Richard went out on his own, and he married a woman. I can't quite find her name here. It doesn't make any difference. The interesting thing about her is she was also she was black and quite light complexioned, and he passed her off as a Penobscot Indian. Now he traveled all over New England, but eventually he did a 2 or 3 year stint in the South, and he was able to get away with it, which was a remarkable thing for the time. And he stayed and traveled and had no problems in passing himself off. And as I said, he was an incredible, well-known and celebrity throughout the country. So how did he end up in the little town of Porter? Well, apparently he performed there. And he performed there at a little inn or a tavern. It was owned by a Thompson, no relation that I know of. But somebody here probably could figure that out, but I don't think he was. In any event, his son, the son of the Mr. Thompson, became his assistant for a while. And him and his wife was Sally, by the way, they loved the little town of Andover. So when it became time for them to retire from the road, they bought a home there, and they had a rather large farm. And apparently the farm itself was almost as eccentric as Richard was. It had a lot of weird sculptures and things. And unfortunately, the home is no longer there. It did burn down. Apparently, Richard's son was not all that swift. He managed to lose his family's inheritance and eventually lost the farm. And the farm burnt, and it's no longer there to be seen. But the town retained the name, became Potter, and Potterville, or Potter. And it is today, and like I said, it's a little suburb, and it has its own zip code. And it's a fascinating little town. We had the picture up with the grave. It's all right. It's a little white picket fence, and he's buried next to Sally. And it's really quite pretty. And next to it is a little garden that is well worth viewing. And then the town, it was also kind of a railroad link, I believe. A lot of small towns didn't want the railroads in the town, so they created a suburb where the railroad ended up. And that was the case of my hometown in Air, Mass. Nobody in that area wanted the railroad in their town, so they passed it off to Air, which is kind of a late arrival in Massachusetts history. But I think that's what happened with Potter, too, is that it became that way. So it's a little railroad. There's the station is still there. Beautiful little country store. I would say if you're ever in the Andover area out towards Route 4, you should really take a moment and go over and visit Richard's. And remember that even back then, a black man could get into the entertainment business and make it big.
He's actually well known in the entertainment industry as being one of the first, people known throughout the country and not just locally, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah. I got most of the information. He was a Mason. And most of the information came from the Masonic Temple in Boston. And they have a great biography about him if you're interested in looking it up.
All right, this guy. Another one where you go, how the heck did this happen? This is Pittsburgh. Minnick Wallace is an Inuit from Greenland. How did he end up in Pittsburgh, New Hampshire? The story is relatively deep. I mean, it's actually pretty incredible who this involves. Originally, Minnick's there's different names here, you know, there's Minnie and there's Minnick, and then it also on the grave is Minnie. But his dad ended up meeting Robert Peary on one of his expeditions into Greenland, and essentially, I think, worked as a guide. Now, what Peary did was bring back the father and some other Inuits, and they were brought in to be in a museum, the Museum of Natural History. And what happened was, they brought them back. The museum didn't even know about this, apparently. So they didn't know what to do with these people that they brought with them. So they housed them downstairs in the basement of the museum, and sort of put them on display as almost like a zoo, believe it or not. But oddly enough, and this is something we run into often in our studies and research, is you find an individual who, if you look at something he did, you could go, this guy really must be a jerk, a bad guy, somehow. But then you find another side to him that is the opposite. And to some degree, that's what happened with the man who basically was running the museum at the time, who on the one hand actually, didn't do a very good job of treating these people humanely. On the other hand, he did connect with Minnick and brought Minnick up, made sure he was educated. He basically took him under his wing, so to speak. On the other hand, one of the things that man did was when Minnick's dad died, they basically took his skeleton and put that on display. Minnick did not know this. Now what's important in some ways too is that for the Inuits, the burial ceremony that they want to have is extremely important. And of course, his dad never got it. Because as it turns out, Minnick never gets this either. But Minnick then went on to be, to go to some of he was on the Macmillan expedition to Greenland. Peary had seen what he thought was an island, which was called Crocker. It was the Crocker land expedition, the Crocker Island, that he had seen when he was up there. So they made this expedition to go up and find it. It did not work out well. The boat on the way up basically got stuck in the ice. One of the Inuits was shot by an engineer. That's a story in itself. But basically, almost everything that could go wrong with that went wrong. If you're interested in following up on that, Bowdoin College over in Brunswick, Maine, has a whole museum devoted to both Macmillan and to Peary, who did both go to Bowdoin. So he was involved with that. He returned to back here, and believe it or not, what he ended up doing was going up to Pittsburgh to work in the lumber industry. And again, he's taken under the wing of a man named Afton Hall, who was one of the owners of the lumbering company at that point, and essentially, again, was offered the job. Apparently, worked there very well. Unfortunately, they all died in the epidemic of 1918. So they were buried there. Now, this is sort of just an interesting aside to what you can run into. Bill and I went up there, and we had been given information about where the grave was. And one of them is from, it was in Find a Grave, made it sound like the grave was very close to Afton Hall's grave. So we found Afton Hall's grave. And Pittsburgh's 3.5 hours away, right? So we're up there. Can we find Minnick? No. Went all over this, thought we did. On the other hand, we would go on a fly fishing trip all the way to Pittsburgh and go up in the morning, come back at night. But this, this was kind of, what are we going to do? We're going to have to come back. So eventually I started looking around for somebody that could find a picture for us, because we could get the information. We didn't have a picture. But we wanted everything in the book to be our pictures. So finally, last spring, Bill and I drove all the way back up there, and we found Minnick's grave. And so we did have to take a couple of trips up there to do it. But again, I mean, how did this happen? And you see, there's a whole story behind it. And that's what's intrigued us throughout this entire process.
I asked a friend of mine if he would, after we failed to find this, I have a lot of friends up there that are guides and lodge owners, and I called one of them up and I asked him, I said, could you go over to the cemetery there and see if you can find Minnick, and get a picture for us, and email it to me. And it was a little while before he got back to me. He sent me an email and he says, Bill, this is Pittsburgh. There's a foot of snow already on the ground. So we had to go back last spring to do it. Now this is the next one. Am I on?
You're on.
Okay.
Where are you to Bill?
Oh, where am I today? Well, right now we're going to go to Portsmouth and South Cemetery. First, you have to, if you've never been to South Cemetery in Portsmouth, you owe it to yourself to go there. There's probably, I think, one, if not the prettiest cemetery in the state. It's quite large. It's almost like a park. In fact, the residents of Portsmouth walk there, walk their dogs there. They're not supposed to, but they do. And they jog there, and it's very, very popular. But there are so many historical figures that are buried there. Up to beginning with the Revolution, all the way up to, I would say the early 20th century, 21st century. It's still in use today, but only a small portion of it is. So the two ladies that we're going to talk about, we put them under the chapter of infamous, I believe.
We did.
Yes. Although they were both very nice ladies and well known at their time, but both of them owned houses of ill repute. They owned the two largest brothels in the city of Portsmouth. And as you know, the city of Portsmouth has always been a naval base, submarine port, a naval base, and that started before the Spanish-American War. And at the time of the Spanish-American War, it grew immensely. I think right at the end of the war, they built the famous prison in Portsmouth Harbor. Was part of the naval station. So Mary Baker and Alter Roberts had a golden opportunity. And the two brothels were located on Marcy Street. Well, if you go there today, there is no, Water Street, I'm sorry, Water Street, got it back on Water Street, right down on the docks. And if you go there today, there is no Water Street, it's Marcy Street. And it's part of Strawberry Bank. Because the good ladies of Portsmouth banished the whole thing. So tried to bury it. Although I dare say that Portsmouth probably had that same reputation all the way through World War II, when it was also a great naval station. The two ladies were kind of very different. They both were rather flamboyant, but they had different personalities. Mary was the most flamboyant of the two, and she dressed very lavishly, and she had, let's see, which one is which now? Yes, she had diamonds in her teeth. Front teeth, she had a diamond, and she had a very fancy carriage, and later she had one of the very first cars, an automobile in the city of Portsmouth, And it was a touring car, so she could put several of her ladies, the new arrivals, and she would drive around town advertising her goods, so to speak. It was pretty smart. Get right down to it. On the other hand, Alter was rarely seen in public, kept to her home, and she dressed in black. She was a recent widow, and that was apparently the reason. But she was also quite flamboyant when it came to dental work, and she had gold teeth. So, in which I've been told that that was kind of a, cash on hand. It was better than the bank. If you had several gold teeth, then you always had something to bank on if things went bad. Mary had, apparently their house was absolutely gorgeous, had a big ballroom. And maybe some of you know that at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, the treaty was negotiated at the large hotel across the river from Wentworth Hotel. How can I forget that? And Teddy Roosevelt, of course, won the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, because he negotiated the treaty. Well, the hotel was owned by another rather notorious character by the name of Jack Jones. And he's also buried in South Cemetery, and we did indeed cover him as well. He came from nothing, just quickly came from nothing, and then owned the largest brewery in the state. And Jack Jones Brewery was going right up until the 60s, when it finally disappeared along with a lot of the other smaller brands. But he owned the hotel, and all of the delegates would come over and visit the homes, so to speak, visit Mary and Alter. And she had a large ballroom, and it was said that the ladies who worked at the home knew more about politics than most people in the state of New Hampshire. Alter actually came from Limerick, Maine, and she arrived about 1897. Mary Baker was born in 1859, died in 1930, and Alter 1855 to 1940. And they are buried in the Sagamore section. The South Cemetery is divided into 5 different cemeteries, and it's privately owned. Most of it is privately owned. Some of it is public, but most of it's private. And they're in the Sagamore section, and they're not buried that far from each other, although we did have a little trouble, I think, finding Alta, but eventually we stumbled onto her, even though we had good liaison. Some scouting went on. So it's nice that they're buried that close together, and they were good friends in life, even though they had this business competition, and they always referred to each other as college friends.
I have some gold teeth.
Do you? Oddly enough, I just found one.
Yeah. Apparently, they almost ran the town. And it's funny, I think it was 2 years ago, we were up in Ketchikan, Alaska, and it's the same thing. There's a whole street up there that they've made a memorial out of now. And but the whole street was similar to this, and apparently they, up until it was when Alaska became a state that they finally were kind of kicked out of there. But up until that point, apparently, like Bill said, politically, they almost ran the town, which is sort of a...
They did, I should add. They both got arrested a couple of times. It just got, the politicians of the time just brushed it aside. Nothing ever came of it. But when, towards the end of their business careers, it was the proper ladies of the town that kind of put an end to it and got the streets changed. But I guess they were both ladies with the heart of gold, if you will. And one story is that the chalice from the Episcopal Church was stolen, gold chalice. And Alter saw that it was replaced. And not only did that, she managed to find out who did it, and they caught him. They both were both known as very, very generous ladies in the town, contributed anonymously to a lot of people that wouldn't, would be underprivileged, if you will, of the town.
Jane, how many times have you driven by Stark Road Cemetery?
I don't know that I ever have realized it was there.
Well, it is, and it's got a couple of interesting stories. Number one that really grabbed, I think, both Bill and I when we looked into this, and we found this out by a book that was written by Janet Hounsel and Ruth Davis Horn, both people that I knew growing up, and they wrote this book about Conway. And that, when we were doing the research, I dug this book out of my library and started looking at it. Now, as kids, I don't know if you remember, but for me, when I was, say, in what was then junior high and into high school, one of my favorite authors was a guy named Kenneth Roberts, who wrote these historical books. One of them was called Arundel, Rabble in Arms. They were all historical novels about the beginnings of the Revolution, and actually a lot of them go back before that, in the French and Indian War and so on. And we were really, I used to love to read about Rogers Rangers, which was a group of people that they were working for, this was when it was still British. It was before the Revolution. But Rogers Rangers were, representing the king and basically fighting against the French and well, I guess French is the best, and a lot of the Native Americans. But what we found out was General Stark, first of all, live free or die, right, is where that comes from, and was the hero at Bennington. And he's well thought of in New Hampshire, where he is buried, which is in our book, but not in this presentation. There's a big statue of him on a horse. So he's kind of New Hampshire's hero. But we found out that he was a Rogers Ranger, which I never knew. And I don't think Bill knew that either. And his brothers were all Rogers Rangers as well. Now, if you didn't read these books and you're not familiar with that aspect, you might not respond the same way we did. But the road is named after the Starks. And they were given that land by King George III. John Stark, who was General John Stark, is not one of the ones listed on that deed. And I think that's because his dad already had the deed for what was then called Starksville in the southern part of the state, which is now Dunbarton. So perhaps that was why he didn't. But the other interesting thing is this grave right here. Now, John Stark is buried in Manchester. We know that. And that's where basically the big memorial to General John Stark is. In the cemetery, in the Stark Cemetery, Stark Road in Conway, there is another grave that sits there, and it says Gen, G-E-N, Stark, buried there. So some people have made the assumption that that is General Stark. It's not, I don't think, because General Stark is in Manchester, and I think that's pretty sure. And there's a whole bunch of other Starks. Also, when we were doing Robert Lowell, the poet, who was buried in, what town was that?
Is that Westminster?
I've forgotten the town exactly, but he's buried, believe it or not, in another Stark cemetery, where all of the son of John Stark and all these other Starks are buried there. And even here, there's a whole bunch of different Starks. And there's some, when you go to look at the graves, it's very confusing. So this is the famous general was 1728 to 1822. This person is 1740 to 1812. So obviously it's a little off, but the question becomes, what is, nobody knows who this is. But it does definitely say Gen Stark on it. Whether it's a cenotaph, which is, a grave that doesn't have the person in it, is possible as a memory, but the dates don't match. But I found it sort of interesting that all came together that way. Because the other thing that graveyard is known for are two red lights, and it's supposedly haunted. Now, Bill and I seem to lack whatever it is you need to pick up on haunted. Because we have gone to a number, and there is a section, we really shied away from making this book, or these books, about just ghosts. But we didn't, some of them stories are hard to not go after. So we did on a few. But when we were at Stark Road, on the Stark Cemetery, I drive by this all the time because to go to Conway, if I'm going from Freedom where we live, I have to go, the quickest way is to go to Stark Road. And it takes you over by Freiburg, so you can get to there, where two of my daughters live, or our daughters. So, I don't know, the only thing I could think of is one day I was coming home and I did two red lights. I think they were the rear tail lights of a car. But neither one of us felt anything. I didn't. And we've been back a couple times.
Yeah, we travel that road a lot.
This one is very interesting.
All set? Yeah.
All set.
Yeah, all right. Actually, the Stark Cemetery and the one I'm about to do, both of us kind of came to by way of Fritz Weatherby, which we kind of think of as a hero. We actually mentioned him in the credits, although neither one of us have ever met him. One of the frustrating things about Fritz is that he always stands someplace about a mile away from where the actual, what he's talking about is. More than one. Oh, the meeting house is up here across the road, and the traffic's running by where his cameraman is. I've heard that's because they only give him one cameraman to film that. So, anyway, so we're going to talk a little bit about a little place that I truly never knew until we did the research on this, and it did kind of come by the way of Fritz. And of course, Fritz was about a mile down the road at Odeon Point, but he did mention the Brackett Massacre and the burial ground that's there. And this is in Rye, New Hampshire. And this dates back to the 1600s. This happened in 1691. And I think, well, to begin with, the synopsis of the story is that a war party of Native Americans, about 40 warriors, made an attack on several families at Sandy Beach, which is now Rye. And these people were absolutely great. Talked about Rogers Rangers. They were kind of the Green Berets of their time, a ranger organization. So these fellows, the Green Berets, SEAL Team 6 had nothing on these guys. They launched their canoes from Kittery across the Piscataqua River. They came across, which is one of the most notorious rivers and tidal rivers in the world, circumnavigated Odeon Point, which had a blockhouse at the time, and they came ashore at Sandy Beach, which we know, is that, what's the name of the beach? Brain cramp here.
Wallace Sands.
Wallace Sands, thank you. They came ashore at Wallace Sands, made an amphibious landing there in their canoes, and then they crossed the marsh. And if you've ever been by Wallace Sands, and you drive through there, I'm sure most of us had. I was in Hampton just yesterday, and I always make a point of driving out the coastal route to get back to the traffic circle to come back to Freedom. And I never fail to do that unless I'm pressed for time, because I love that drive. But I don't know how many thousands of times I've been on that route and never knew that across from Wallace Sands, that marsh was locally known as Massacre Marsh. Because what the Indians did, they crossed that marsh and they surprised a group of settlers or colonists who were there harvesting saltwater hay. And it was truly a massacre. There were 21 colonists killed right on the spot. And they were rather brutal about it. They, of course, took a couple of captives, which they returned up to Quebec, where they were held for ransom. One of them who actually made it home, she married a Frenchman and actually made it home, came all the way back and was able to reclaim her property, or was given compensation for her property, which is a pretty remarkable story. The actual cemetery, there is these two photos. It's actually been updated. We were there not too long ago. This spring, I guess, we came back down and visited again, take some more pictures. And there's a couple of new signs. Rye, of course, celebrated its 300th anniversary along with Portsmouth. And I heard Stratton was also 300 years old. So they've updated these signs a little bit, but there is no historical marker. And because it is off the beach road, it's kind of unknown. And I think very, very few people know that it's there or have ever heard the story. One little interesting aspect about the story is that there was one of the victims, not all of the victims were killed at the marsh. They went up the road, Brackett Lane, as it was Brackett. It's still Brackett Road, but it was Brackett Lane in those days. They went up the road and they attacked a couple of houses, and they burnt them to the ground, and some of the inhabitants, of course, were still inside. One of those victims was a Mrs. Rand, who was blind, and she was given premonitions. And in the morning of the massacre, her husband left to be at a mill. He left for the mill. And she said, "Don't go. Something's wrong. What's going to happen today?" She was right, and she paid the ultimate price. And so did he, because he was killed along the road. I'm told that there was a marker there at one time where he was killed, but we've never been able to find it. We just talked a little bit about haunting, and as Rick said, we did. We went out of our way not to be ghost hunters. And this cemetery is also reported to be haunted. And that's one cemetery, when you stand in that little cemetery and look out across that marsh. No, we didn't see spirits or humans crossing the marsh, but you could imagine it. And the loneliness, the sadness, the depression of that day, it gets to you. You really feel it. It's a little difficult to find. The easiest way is when you're at Wallace Sands, is to take Marsh Road. It goes off to the right if you're going westerly along the beach. And it brings you right to Brackett Road. So you just turn left onto Brackett Road, follow it almost to where it comes back out onto the Seacoast Road. And it's on your left. And we just saw the little markers there. Those two markers are still there, but there's some nice new ones they've replaced. The victims they were buried right where they fell, where they found the bodies. And there's nothing there, there's no fancy stones, they're just rocks to indicate that somebody was buried there. If you do, you get pretty...
There's something...
Yeah, there's something about that cemetery that kind of gets to you. I think it's just the sadness. And it's worth saying, yes, it was a very bloody massacre, but it's a two-way road. The Indians and Native Americans suffered equally bad and were massacred. I mean, the massacre in Dover was horrible. Two of them, the one where the whites were massacred and the one previous to that, which was revenge, was where the Indians were massacred. It was a two-way street, and we have to remember that, and we have to remember it was a different time, and that's the thing about history. So.
And there is something about that place. I mean, we did mention we don't, we're not doing the ghost thing. But you stand there and you're among all these rocks and nothing has really changed from what it looked like in those days. And you stand there and the one thing that went through my mind was, let me take, you know, all of my friends from Freedom, let's say, and we're all together, and we're all doing something together, and suddenly we're massacred. And that just sort of radiates out of the ground there, the sadness of it. And like Bill said, though, it went both ways, and in our book we have articles that cover both directions of what went on. Certainly those days really were difficult days to live. Can you imagine, really, thinking about, you just come out your front door, you built this farm, and if you're one of the settlers, but you never know what's going to come out of those woods. On the other hand, you know, what happened to the natives was also not pretty. And, you know, we do John Captain Lovewell, where, you know, who was one of the people who was, you know, basically a scalp hunter. And, you know, it's this very, you just get this sense of how difficult on all sides it must have been to live in those days, in a lot of ways. In a minute, I may be looking at one that's a grave in Freedom itself near where I live. And again, you just get this, you know, Shawtown is a town that's beyond where we live, is no longer there. It's cellar holes. It's near the Danforth Bay campground, if you happen to know where that is. But it's just amazing to think how they made a living. I mean, it's rocks, it's sand, and, you know, how they managed to get by, and yet they built these houses and they live. But anyway, that's really another story.
Speak up.
Okay. All right, this one, how many people know who John Langdon was?
School blender.
Okay, this is one of those ones where we go, yeah, and this was me, this was both of us. And in fact, my wife Jane and I went to his house once in Portsmouth, which is there, and it's a gorgeous old you know, old sea captain's type house. And I remember being in there and listening to the docent and talking about the captain and who he was. And you start to realize, wait a minute, why don't we know more about John Langdon? New Hampshire probably wouldn't be here today if it weren't for people like John Langdon. And why we don't hear about them, I don't know. I didn't get it in high school, I don't think. But you know, this guy was, there's a number of them, but this one is one of the ones that stands out for us. But also the fact that his character comes through in a couple of the stories that we're doing. And essentially, he was one of the more, you know, powerful people. He was a shipbuilder. He did probably make his money from slavery. We were also quite surprised when we started doing this book how much slavery of one form or another did go on in New Hampshire. A lot of them were house servants. John Langdon's dad was definitely, you know, was a slave owner, and probably was known for, you know, not being terribly great to the people that were working for him. His place, by the way, is, I don't know if you know, off of Route 1A, if you were going to go to where the massacre was, to Rye. It's called the Urban, what is it called?
Forestry Center.
Forestry Center was the Langdon land. And the Langdon family, some of them are buried there. And I believe there was a cenotaph for John there too, isn't there? I think so. Because John, of course, John is buried in the Norse Cemetery in Portsmouth. But, you know, here was a guy that was, you know, one of the first United States senators. I think he was President Pro Tem of the U.S. Senate, member of the Continental Congress, supporter of the Revolution. He was actually one of the first presidents of New Hampshire. We call them governors today. He, as a shipbuilder, you know the ship that is on the New Hampshire seal, the Raleigh, built by John Langdon. John Paul Jones's ship, the Ranger, was also built by John Langdon. But he was involved at the Battle of Bennington. In fact, he financed John Stark to be able to go to Bennington. But obviously the tariffs and so on that he was dealing with are making it difficult. Now, one of the reasons that John Langdon may not be as famous is he was not college educated. I mean, a lot of the people that we know of and hear about were college educated. They learned how to write. They were orators. They learned how to speak. And essentially, they are remembered because they wrote their memoirs, wrote their opinions, and we know them today. Langdon really wasn't known for that, even though he was one of the most influential. But one of the things that really stands out to me with John Langdon is the way he did treat his enslaved people. They were still enslaved, and he did, but he did pay them wages. And he did treat them apparently very humanely, as I guess you could treat anybody who's enslaved. And he even provided money, believe it or not, so they would have, when he died, they would have a suit to wear to his funeral, and presumably got to keep it. The other thing, and it's one I hope we have time to look at, is Una Judge, which we'll get into in a minute or two. But Una Judge was an escaped slave. Very, very interesting story. And if it were not for John Langdon, she would not have escaped and became a free person. So you have, on the one hand, this guy who's made his money with slavery, absolutely no question, shipbuilder. All of those slaves were brought to Portsmouth before they went down south. And so basically he was involved with the slave sales. On the other hand, he was coming around to treating his own slaves with some humanity. And basically, like I said, really helped Una Judge escape. On Lafayette Road, as you're going out of Portsmouth, it's Route 1, you go around through the circle, and then you head out to Route 1. There's a big Episcopal church up there. Sits up on a hill. If you go up there, and this is not the Langdon Family Cemetery, which is at the Urban Forestry Center. This is a slave cemetery, and basically it sits there. It's on the it's on the Black history thing that Portsmouth has done, and there's a sign there. And he did provide a place for them to be buried. And there are sort of primitive markers there. And I also just wanted to point out, for example, this was, I think, written to Franklin, put an end to this abominable proceeding in America, which he was talking about slavery. So on the one hand, you have somebody who was already sort of in some ways, I suppose, ahead of his time. No, I want to go back, because I think, we had this picture. So this is in North Cemetery, this is the Langdon grave, which is a crypt really. And this is the slave cemetery that's up by the church on Lafayette Road. Again, this is a spot that when you go there,
You gotta look for it.
you do have to look for it. It's next to the church. But there's something about being there that just, again, like with a massacre, comes out of the ground. A certain amount of sadness, a certain amount of something that I can't really put my fingers on. On the one hand, it was something that he, provided this. On the other hand, it's a shame that it's had to be. And it is part of the Black History Trail, Heritage Trail, which, if you are in Portsmouth, is really an interesting thing to follow, is to go along the Heritage Trail for Black history.
I have a question.
Cool, yes, that is absolutely right. And that's how they got what they needed to fight in Bunker Hill. So, I mean, Langdon was very much a part of all of this, of moving forward. This next man, which Bill's going to talk about, William Whipple, also turns out to be a very similar kind of story.
Are we going to talk about Whipple and are we going to talk about Prince, or do both together?
You can do it. Can
Okay.
you do it?
Well, I got mostly Prince here, but that's all right. Another fellow, another very historical fellow, signer of the Declaration of Independence, is William Whipple. And he's equally important to Langdon. Another fellow who made his fortune. He was born in Kittery, shippers, and he got his education in public schools.
You speak up.
And then he became a captain, and he was in the infamous triangle trade. So he made his money too in the slave trade, or his family did. Both sides of his family did. And both Rick and I, there were 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence in Massachusetts, and I'm willing to bet that nobody can name all 3. That's probably wrong. Somebody here can.
Josiah Bartlett.
What's that?
Josiah Bartlett.
Yeah. Oh, well, of course,
Josiah
Bartlett.
Ware.
Yes. And Ware.
My first cousin.
Josiah Ware, of course, and Whipple, William Whipple, were the 3 signers. And Langdon did sign the Constitution. He would have been at the Declaration of Independence, but for some reason he was delayed, so he would have been a 4th signer, but he wasn't. So, anyway, Whipple was one of the interesting things, and we kind of split this, and Rick actually wrote the section on William, so I'm kind of glossing over that, because the section I wrote was on his servant and manslave, which was Prince Whipple. And Prince was an equally intricate part of the American Revolution. He served at Whipple's side all through the war. And Whipple became a general. He commanded the New Hampshire regiments at Saratoga. He was in several other campaigns as well. Knew Washington well, was a friend, and a great man. And we wouldn't be standing here today if it were not for Langdon and Whipple. And I think you could say equally that his slave and his friend, and there's no question he was his friend, was Prince Whipple. Prince was brought to this country as a slave. In 1760, he was 10 years old, and he came with his brother, Cuffy. And they were purchased by the Whipple family. And Whipple was a trusted servant of William. And a lot of people think, if you look up William, Prince, a lot of people say, oh, in the picture of Washington crossing the Delaware, there is a black man, and that's Prince. That's not true. And you're going to see that all over the place. I looked this up the other night on the internet, and sure enough, it comes right up. And I looked at a YouTube video. Don't trust YouTube too much. Except But the fellow that's in the boat, rowing the boat, is not, it's not Prince. Him and William were not even anywhere near the Delaware or the
They were in Philadelphia, I believe.
Yeah, I think so, yes. They were a long ways away. They didn't participate. But nonetheless, among other things, there is some controversy because, like Langdon, Whipple was far ahead of his time. He had slaves and he profited from it. And the big reason New Hampshire, big role in slavery is there were not a lot of slaves compared to the South. And most of them were, as Rick said, they were domestic servants, they were not field hands. But the one thing about, this is typical New Hampshire, there was no tariff on slaves in New Hampshire. So it became a port of entry for slaves. And then they were shipped to the South. So it was cheaper to bring them here than it was actually to ship them right into the South. So that's just one reason that somebody in the triangle trade profited so much here. But there's a controversy about when the Prince was freed. And another myth about Prince was that at Saratoga, and I'll paraphrase this, apparently William said to Prince, all right, let's go down and, beat the British and we'll gain our freedom. And of course, Prince said, hey, I'm not free. So, and the story is that he was freed on the spot, and that is absolutely not true. That part we know. And we originally, when we did the research on this, most of the research said that he was freed after William's death. But fortunately, Rick participated in a Lolly program given by the woman who's the historian. I got her name here someplace.
For the Moffat.
Yeah,
Ladd House.
Moffat Ladd She's the historian for the home in Portsmouth, which was William's home, and incidentally became Prince's home as well. And she claims that he was given his freedom before. And while I was fooling around looking at the internet last night, Prince married his wife Diana in 1781, and she had been given her freedom that day, and she was her 21st birthday. She was another family, but she'd been given her freedom. So it seems to me that might be a good point, that Prince was already free. But according to, we had her name here, I got it here someplace. According to the lady at the Moffat Ladd House, Erica McAvoy is the historian for the Moffat Ladd House. She claims that he was given his death in 1784. So, and before William died, he died in 1785.
We have a manuscript. This is his manumission, which was the freedom, and this is on record. The original. This is obviously retyped, so you can read it. But he was given on the 19th February of the year of 1784. So he was given his freedom a little bit ahead of Whipple's death. But the reason we find that sort of, telling is, again, if William Whipple, promised this and then never delivered. And the original story we had was that his wife, after his death, after William's death, was the one that freed Prince. And, that just tells you a little different story about his character than the fact that he did do it before he himself died. Maybe. I don't know. But again, we as I said about John Langdon, we kind of find these people who on the one hand you can say, oh God, slave owner, all this. But on the other hand, this part of their stories, and in the next story that I'm going to tell, there is some reason to believe that Whipple and John Langdon had different points of view on slavery, even though they practiced it.
In 1791, there were 19 other African slaves in Portsmouth, and they petitioned the New Hampshire legislature at that time for their emancipation. And I guess infamously, they never voted on it. The motion was tabled. It never got up before the legislature. So, but a lot of people think that because Prince was at the Declaration of Independence, some of the wording is very close. Which is another point. Obviously, Prince knew how to read and write. And that certainly tells you a lot about how the family treated their slaves. And the other thing is, too, upon the death of William, William's wife actually built a home, and it's in behind the Moffat Ladd House in Portsmouth. And she built it for them to live in for the rest of their lives, and they did. And that, if you tour the house, they will point it out and tell you to. And of course, if you stand outside of the fence and look at the house, there is a rather large chestnut tree there. And supposedly, Prince and William gathered up some chestnuts in Philadelphia in front of the Independence Hall, brought them back to Portsmouth, and planted them in front of the house, and the chestnut tree is there today.
Gorgeous tree.
Yeah, it's still, yeah, I guess if that is the tree, it's there. So it's an interesting story, and Prince and William are both buried in North Cemetery in Portsmouth. Prince, which is another thing that speaks of the family, as him and his wife are buried right together. Just recently, they put up a little stone or a little plaque for his wife. She was married right next to him. That wasn't there when we took the first photos. When we went down to do the video, we found that they had added a little plaque, which is very nice. And apparently, some of his children are also buried in North Cemetery. So it speaks a lot that they thought so well of him that they did not bury him in the slave cemetery of Portsmouth, which of course we know today is recognized, and there's a monument there. They actually buried him in the same cemetery that his former master was. I think that speaks more.
Imagine you're a slave that's managed to run away. You're walking down the streets of Portsmouth, and you are recognized by, my goodness, of all people, John Langdon's daughter. Now, this lady who's walking down the streets of Portsmouth and is freed used to be Martha Washington's primary house servant. When Washington was president and they had to move to Philadelphia, Una Judge was able to find a way to get onto a ship from Philadelphia with some help. Because one thing that was hugely different in those days was Philadelphia, New York City, places like that had a lot of freed slaves. People who had, one way or another, come up and were living in the North in freedom, in theory. And Una Judge was one of them. While Washington and Martha were in Philadelphia, she managed to get to Portsmouth. So she's walking down the street that day. And of course, the Langdons were personal friends of the Washingtons, as were the Whipples, too, I believe. But the Langdons were definitely friends with the Washingtons. Washington came to Portsmouth at one point, and obviously the Langdons had a lot to do with that visit. So they come down, and so the daughter obviously knows who Una is, because they knew the Washingtons well enough, had visited them in Virginia, knew her well enough that she knew who it was. So she comes back and tells her dad. Her dad at that point was a senator, and basically a friend of Washington's, so he tells George Washington. And there's somewhat of a complicated story that goes on about it, This is an advertisement that was put up by the Washingtons, basically asking for her to be returned. And that there was, I believe, a $10 reward for having her turned in. Well, two things kind of happened to make a little longer story short. Is first of all, he contacted William Whipple, not William Whipple, William Whipple's brother, Joseph, who was the head of the import area at that time, customs, and said, can you get her back? So in the Whipple household, they came up with an idea of, okay, what about if she comes back, but when Martha Washington dies, she's free. Nobody really that we could really tell where this came from, whether Whipple came up with it. But apparently Una, at least, up front, kind of went along with it. But when it was time for it to happen, she didn't do it. She wouldn't go. And she did say that working for the Washingtons, she was not mistreated, but her point was she was not free. And she did live the rest of her life, doing pretty much household labor and things for people, but her point was, but yes, I am free, even though I was relatively well taken care of. So later on, there's a number of attempts to get her back. And finally, basically, they send it's a relative of Martha's to the Langdons, and they actually bring they want Langdon to turn her over, and Langdon actually helped her escape. Now back then she escaped to Greenland. Not that far away, but back then it was far enough away that she did escape. So, and she became, somebody actually interviewed her, and there, you can find the transcript of that interview, and basically, and she talks about what it was like to work for the Washingtons, and as I said, admitted that it wasn't terrible, but she would rather work hard and be in poverty for the rest of her life than to be a slave. But that story really captured my imagination. There's a couple of books written about it, about Una, and she did live to be a fairly ripe old age. She got married to a guy named John Staines, and they spent the rest of their life. And he was also, I think, half black, half white. But they did manage to live out their lives. We do not have a picture of a grave for this. There is apparently a grave site in Greenland. It's private property. We were asked not to go, so we respected that and did not. And apparently it's a pile of rocks, so it's not, it's not like we would have seen a regular stone, but we felt like, we did not want to push that. And I think even for the Heritage Trail,
Yeah,
they
Yeah,
said, no, please, respect that. But I thought that was sort of a very interesting story, and imagining walking down the street and being recognized.
running along here.
Yeah. So do we want to skip the murders?
No, I don't know. I think we are running a little long.
You know the story about the woman who was murdered by the what was it,
Baptist Church?
the Baptist Church?
We're going to skip ahead here a little bit. This will be the last one. We'll get you out of here. You guys are all genealogists. In the Wolfeboro area, there are a lot of Gliddens and Tuttles. And the Glidden family I am related to, and the Tuttle family too. And the descendants of the Glidden family, the original one that came here, lived in Portsmouth, Charles Glidden. There was a blacksmith there, that would have been in the 1600s, and then he moved on up to Hilton Head, which became Dover. But in New Durham was the beginning of the Free Will Baptist Church. So apparently some of the Gliddens came up there to be part of that church. I'm kind of guessing here. And we do have a very, very accurate family genealogy of the Glidden family. It was published in 1922. And it does mention this. It doesn't mention this woman, but it does mention her husband. And her name was Sarah. She died in 1825. And she is thought to have been a witch. Which immediately when I saw this, it struck me as, wow, that's pretty cool. Got a witch in the family. So anyway, what led people to believe this was that she was not a big churchgoer. She would rather work in her fields and stay away from the actual church services. But ironically, out in her field one day, out of the clear blue, not a cloud in the sky, she was struck by a bolt of lightning. And that, of course, led to the story that she was perhaps a witch. So she is buried, and she's buried on private property. I think it's actually New Durham. Alton. Maybe it is Alton. I think it's Alton. We said Alton, so anyway. It's on private property. And among other things that lends itself to the story was that there was a slab placed on top of her. Well, that, there are a lot of graves from colonial times where a slab was put on top of a grave. And the person who buried there got the name of, they were called a witch. And it's probably not true. I think York has a very famous one, the cemetery at the First Parish Church in York. There is a grave there that has a slab over it. And the poor woman interned there is thought to have been a witch, not true. Well, that's the same with Sarah. But the reason I love the story, aside from the fact that it's a relative, and I kind of have documented proof about that. Now, I'd like to talk to anybody that might know about this, but she is buried in a guy's garden. We knew this, and there is a book. There's two books that actually do mention it, which is how I knew about it. And I was determined we were going to find her. And so one day we were coming back from somewhere, and we said, let's go look. And we drove around, couldn't find a cemetery or anything. We do know approximately. So we drove into this house, drove up the driveway, and I'm not the kind of guy to do this, but I went up and knocked on the door, and this guy came out, and had half of his face was covered in shaving cream. I go, oh God, what have I done? I'm so sorry. And I said, I'm looking to find a relative. She's supposed to be a witch. And he goes, oh yeah, she's buried next door. So we went over next door, and there was nobody home. And we in the cemeteries and in doing this, we have tried to be very respectful of people's property and the places that we visited. So we were reluctant to go snooping around looking for a grave. So as it was, we were coming back from Concord, I remember, and I said, let's give it one more try. It was fairly late in the afternoon, and we did. We found, after stumbling around a little bit, we found the driveway, and we drove up. Didn't look like anybody was around, but there was a car. And again, I got out of the car, and I went, oh boy, probably get shot at. Yeah. Knocked on the door. Another guy comes out, kind of startled, and I said, you're not going to believe this. And he says, you're looking for the witch. I said, yeah, I'm related to her. So I think part of it is two unique stories. There was at least, was the fun of trying to find it, which was all about this book, was the fun about doing this, finding the history about these people. But to find a relative, and to find two, and we've met a lot of really great people doing this. We made some good friends. Some people helped us out at various places. And just, this guy was unbelievable because he came out and he says, yeah, she's in the garden. And he had to literally clear brush out. And sure enough, scooped away the brush. There she was. There was a slab. And there was my great ancestor. I'll leave you there.
Now the picture's not a slab.
Yes, it is. Is the picture up?
No, he just took it down.
There is a stone, yes, there is a stone.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there is a stone, but you can see right here is the slab. It's covered up with pine needles, but this is the
Well,
slab.
we can't get out.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't want to be cursed or anything, so I didn't,
Again, this is an end. Just very quickly, I'm not going to talk about him, but Ogden Nash is buried in Northampton, New Hampshire. And I couldn't help but just figure out one about. But when grandparents enter the door, discipline flies out the window. A door is what a dog is perpetually on the wrong side of. If you've ever had a dog, that's absolutely the case. Candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker. That was one of his most famous ones, I think. Yeah, you're only young once, but you stay immature indefinitely. And that's, I think, what's happened to us. So anyway, thank you very much.
thank you.
We are really pleased that you've all had a chance to share what Rick and Bill have put together. And the question came from someone, when did you expect your book to be out?
Well, the other day, we have an editor. I got a little note from our editor saying, can you provide me with your blurb for the back cover? So that usually means the book is more or less ready. I have found a couple of things that I want to change because I found that maybe I was a little off or I wasn't clear. And I want to make a couple of things. So we will probably get a copy of it one last time to change it. I'm hoping we might be able to at least, I'm going to call tomorrow and see if we can get it by Christmas.
Oh, the person I said they were hoping January, but even so, you'd like those for gifts.
Yeah, well, the other thing they do sometimes is they allow you to pay for it ahead of time, and then they'll ship it to you later. But you do that through the publishers. If that happens, we'll put up a link, if nowhere else, I guess, on our YouTube account,
Okay.
where you can be able
I
to
was
go
just going
buy
to
the
say,
book.
where are they going to find you, to contact you? Just Rick Davidson, these two old guys here?
Well, I do have a website, which is rick-davidson.com,
That's pretty simple.
which is,
I think through YouTube.
and YouTube would be able to, you would be able to get our information.
I think there's at least 21 episodes that I've come across on YouTube and collected in my folder. They're very interesting little clips, so you would enjoy that if you can manage to get into YouTube.
Yeah, hit that like button.
So I want to thank, has anybody got a question that they can't just hold on to or anything? You're all set. One more round of applause for them. Thank you so much.